We are. Oh, cool. Welcome, everybody, to Quarantini time. Quarantini hour. Sorry, should be a bit more specific. Cheers. Ooh.
What are you drinking?
The sugar juice. Sugar juice from Haiti. From Port-au-Prince.
Sugar juice.
Yes, Babancourt rum. And I was just playing a little Caribbean, I'd been fooling with a little Caribbean medley of different things. The bambula. Written by Louis Moreau Gottschalk from New Orleans in the 19th century. And then I was also messing around with which is called Las Campanillas by Basile Barrez, who was a Creole from New Orleans, and interestingly was a slave, and was writing, composing music that got published while he was still a slave, and he was collecting royalties as a slave, and lived on Royal Street. And then, what was the other thing I was playing? I was playing, oh yeah. Sort of a variation of La Bella Cubana, a Cuban danzón from around the same time. And yeah, just fooling around on the piano basically, which was the game plan here at Quarantini headquarters at Quarantini o'clock. Number 42 or 43?
42.
Number 42, my goodness.
Isn't that the answer to the question of the universe?
I don't know. I don't know, but if it's the answer to how many weeks have we been on lockdown, quarantine, no gigs, then I guess 42 weeks.
No.
That can't be right.
No, because
that
the Eurotini ones that...
Oh, yeah. Including the Thursday ones. Okay, so anyway, long time. So thank you for tuning in, if you've tuned in. Once again, there's absolutely no game plan here whatsoever. Making it up as we go along. And really, it's a chance to play a little bit of music and answer any questions you might have, if indeed there's anybody watching.
There are people watching, and this...
Send in where you're watching. Tell us, let us know where you're watching from. So
This isn't a question, but it's an interesting fact. I wonder if you knew it. Brian Mitch says his wife was just at Louis Moreau Gottschalk's... I can never say that. Gottschalk's grave at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn.
Wow.
Did you know
That's
that
interesting.
That's where it was?
I still seem to remember reading that. I read the Frederick Starr book, Bamboo, a long time ago. But yeah, how interesting. Yeah, the Bambula. Louis Moreau Gottschalk. His dad was English, and his mum came from French family who were refugees from the place that makes the rum I'm drinking right now. It wasn't called Haiti then, it was Saint-Domingue. So where are people watching from? Do we know yet?
Yes. Mid-City?
All the way in Mid-City? My God.
Sydney,
Ah,
Baltimore, San Diego, Dallas,
good.
Central Texas, Austin, Long Island, my people, Napa, more Sydney, Hyattsville, Maryland, Orlando,
A lot of Sydnonians.
Sydnonians,
Sydnations.
Orlando. Want a question?
Yes.
Diane Horrigan says, you are such an incredible writer. Is there any particular line or lyric from a song that is not yours that you deem so spectacular that you wish you had written it?
Oh, loads. Well, the entire lyrical content of Stardust, for one. And now the purple dust of twilight time steals across the meadows of my heart. High up in the sky, the little stars climb. As the one we talked about last week, the mere idea of you, from the very thought of you. Loads, really. If I actually put my mind to it, I could sit down and write them all out. But of course, when you ask to actually think of some off the top of your head, they all vanish into the ether. Song lyrics, yeah, it's hard to write good song lyrics. And some of the best ones probably were written and just kind of thrown out there, really. I do have some favourites. There's a line from on an R.Up Soul tune I like by Little Beaver. And right at the very end, as the song's fading out, he sings, "Your love is so good, just like I knew it would."
What about she thinks her advice is a contribution?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, that's a line from an Ernie Cato song. And I actually asked Alan Toussaint, I said, what was the deal with that line? What is Cato singing on that line? And he said, I wrote out the words. He said, I had two versions. She thinks her advice is a contribution. It's from Mother-in-Law, his big hit Mother-in-Law. She goes, she thinks her advice is a contribution, but if she would leave, that would be the solution. And the other verse he had was, she thinks her advice is the Constitution. Constitution, contribution. Ernie Cato thought, well, probably, I don't know what he was thinking, but he somehow managed to sing both of them at the same time. And what he sang on the record was, she thinks her advice is a contribution. So I was to Alan Toussaint in New York. I said, man, what is a contribution? He said, man, I've got no idea what was going through Cato's mind. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. I'm supposed to be reading out, and I'm remiss because I forgot until I remembered right at the last minute. There wasn't enough time to write all the names down, but there's something like 90 names of people who've joined up, joined my Patreon club online. And apologies, I shall read names out next week, I promise. And also next week, we're going to have a guest. It's been a while since we've had a guest, mainly because I've been busy in the studio working on the rhythm tracks for the record I'm making with the Absolute Monster Gentlemen. It's a project we decided to do while we were all in lockdown and while we were here. So that's been sort of priority number one. And the guests have sort of taken a bit of a back seat. But next week we're going to have Jameson Ross, who I think is one of the greatest players here in the city of New Orleans right now. And he was in the Absolute Monster Gentlemen for a couple of years. my band. And then when I was nominated for a Grammy for Go-Go Juice, he was also nominated for a Grammy for being the best jazz vocalist of the year. This was at a time when he was the drummer in my band. And he really is a great musician and great singer. And he's become quite a name in his own right, touring all around the world and putting out records. So he's going to be here next week to join me. We're going to set up the drums. And I'll get a chance to introduce Jameson Ross to those of you who don't already know him. So, any more, any little interesting
here's the
observations?
thing. I just saw this on the news. I don't know if you saw. This is from John Hyman. He says, "Might you do a little something for Sylvester Francis from the Backstreet Museum, who passed today?"
Ah,
Yeah.
that's a real shame.
Yeah.
Wow, the Backstreet Cultural Museum, for people who don't know, is a little house in the Treme neighborhood, inside which was an amazing collection of New Orleans culture and history, cultural and historical artifacts, from Mardi Gras Indian suits to old photographs to instruments, all kinds of stuff. And Sylvester was the guy that would often be sitting out in front of the house in the shade and who would give you admission if you wanted to go in and check it all out. Wow. Well, that's well, you know how we do this in New Orleans. special little second line, and Just a Closer Walk for Sylvester. Wow. Another great New Orleans character, sadly missed. Thanks, John, for letting me know that.
He says, thank you, John, soothed my soul. And then he says, and yes, he sure did ramble.
He did ramble. He did ramble. One of the very sad things for people everywhere, I suppose, but perhaps we feel it more here in New Orleans because there's a special thing that happens here when we lose someone in the music community. There's usually a street party called a second line. And very soon after lockdown in New Orleans, we got the very sad news that Ellis Marsalis had died, and he was something of an iconic father figure in New Orleans, and it was tragic for everybody that they weren't able to pay their respects to him with a big second line parade, because you cannot do that kind of thing right now. So yeah, very sad. Yeah, I mean, ordinarily there'd be a big second line for Sylvester. I don't know quite how that's going to happen, but anyway, I'll drink a toast to him. Here's to Sylvester at the Backstreet Museum. I hope somebody will keep the museum going.
Yeah. Here's a question from YouTube from the Schmidios. Who are some musicians you have only played with once or twice and would kill to play with again?
That I'd actually literally kill. Wow, to play with again. Well, when we went to Cuba last November, the Absolute Monster Gentlemen, and performed in Havana, we were the first New Orleans R&B band to ever play in Cuba. And we went down, myself, Cornell Williams and A.J. Hall, and I supplemented the band with 4 amazing Cuban musicians, and we rehearsed and got to do.
You had the horns, and then you had Hernan and Dennis.
So 5 musicians. Dennis Bofill, great percussionist, and Hernan Lopez Nusa. Amazing bunch, and we did the rehearsals and prepared for these shows, and we did the played at the National Theatre in Havana, and then which is a very beautiful, great big auditorium with bats flying around in it. Yeah, right, and the Cuban audience were really, really digging it. They never had a chance to see a New Orleans funk band before, and they were all up dancing. And then we played a tiny little nightclub. And we rocked that joint too, to see Cubans all dancing to Tipatina. And When You Get Back was really a thrill. And that was too quick. So I'd love to play with those guys again. You know, there's a lot of musicians who have passed that I wish I could have an opportunity to share the stage with. You know, really miss Ernie Cato and Jesse Hill and Dr. John. Wow. Well, people I've only played with, Ike Turner. I was playing piano and he was sitting next to me playing the B3 one night with B.B. King. That was pretty hip. God, once again, all these names have come back. Plaz Johnson I got to play with a couple of times, the saxophone player that did perhaps the most famous tenor sax solo or riff was the Pink Panther theme. That's Plaz Johnson from New Orleans. I got to play with Earl Palmer one time. I'd love to.
Only once?
Mm-hmm. Oh. Yeah, legendary New Orleans drummer. Herbert Hardesty, Red Tyler. Man, I could go on all night long with people, but that's mostly people that have passed away. I think the question really is about people who are still around that I'd like to play with again. I'm lucky enough to have played with pretty much everybody I ever had an ambition to play with. One person I've never played with is Ry Cooder. It'd be great to play. I've always admired Ry Cooder hugely.
Never know.
Yeah.
Someday. Here's a question from Sonny Barksdale.
Hey, Sonny, how are you? I haven't seen Sonny for 4 months.
4 months?
Since the last Chikiwawa gig. 5 months now.
August. 5.5 months.
And Sonny's was one of the regular Tuesday night characters at Chikiwawa.
He says, when people talk about New Orleans piano players, seldom do you hear Ronnie Cole mentioned. Did you ever see him play?
No, I didn't see Ronnie Cole. He just passed away last week.
Yeah.
I didn't really know much about Ronnie Cole, but I was surprised to learn that he was from, I don't know where he was from, but he moved to New Orleans in the 60s.
Was it Chicago?
I don't know.
I don't remember.
I don't know, but I don't really think of him as a New Orleans piano player, stylistically. He was associated with New Orleans, but I don't really think of him as a New Orleans stylist particularly. But I'm sure he was a good piano player. I don't really know very much about Ronnie Cole, to be honest with you.
Here's a question from Gretchen Bell. She says, could you demonstrate clave, not the instrument? I've heard there are 2 to 3 different claves, but do not understand what it refers to. Google doesn't help.
Well, clave literally means key, Spanish word for key. And if you're familiar with the sound of Cuban music, you'll know that percussion plays a very important role. And an interesting thing happens in this part of the world. I say this part of the world because New Orleans represents the northernmost tip of this Creole world, of which the center really was Havana. And when Cuban musicians play together, it might sound like it's very random to someone who doesn't understand or someone who's not familiar with the music. But actually there are quite strict rules that govern the parts that the people play. And in order for it to sound good and for it to swing, all the parts have to interlock. And that, I'm speaking really of the piano and the percussion and the bass. And there's a device they use which gives everybody a rough idea of what their role is. And it's called the key, or it's called the clave. And as a good example of Cuban clave in New Orleans music, and I was just listening today to a Professor Longhair tune from the 50s, where clave is played. And clave, as the question pointed out, is a rhythmic figure, 2-bar figure, or 1-bar figure. Is it 1 bar or 2 bars? 2-bar figure. But it's also the name of the 2 sticks, and it's 2 sticks called claves, hardwood, that has a sound that cuts right through. So one person's job is to play clave all the way through a tune, and then that is something that everybody then can refer to when they're playing their part. And it's, as I say, it's a Cuban thing, but there's old records here in New Orleans that have the clave too. And one of them, as I say, was the tune I was listening to today, an old recording by Professor Longhair. 2 simple basic claves, and it's 2-3 or 3-2. And the 3-2 version is the most common one, and you will find it in if you play that rhythm here. People associate it with, of all people, Bo Diddley. He goes. Except here they don't call it clave. The name for that rhythm was shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Shave and a haircut, 2 bits.
I go all day.
I go one day. I go one day. Giacomo fino hanande, Giacomo finale. My spy boy, your spy boy, sitting on the fire. I'm gonna set your tail on fire, talking about it here. So that's a real basic example. No one in New Orleans actually really plays it as stiff as that, but it's the rhythm that underpins it. So that's called 3-2 clave, because it's 3 and then 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. The other clave, or another clave, is 2-3, which is that same thing turned around, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 2, bap, 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 gong. So, if you're playing 2-3 clave, then you might play and in like. You'd have a heavy bass, chung, gang, 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 boom, gang. So you'd play in the gap. So where the gap, the space that the gap creates, indicates where the bass would go, and everything folds in around that. So it's really, there's a more complicated clave figure, which is called wawanko clave. And wawanko is one of three kinds of rumba. I think it's Yambu, Colombia, and can't remember the other one. Anyway, that's ba 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 ga ga chuk ba ga ba 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 chuk ba 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 ba. So that's a bit more syncopated. That's dotted, that second thing. Ba 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 ba. And that sounds a bit like the Congo. Everyone's familiar with the dreaded conga line at the party. Let's all do the conga. So let's all do the conga. Like the corniest Hollywood Latino thing. But actually, if you actually see the real conga line, as I have been fortunate enough to see in Santiago at Mardi Gras time, at Carnival time, the real conga is a very, very powerful African rhythm.
I've seen real ones at weddings on Long Island.
Yeah, either Santiago, Cuba at Carnival time, or at a wedding in Long Island.
Or Massapequa.
Yeah,
Or Huntington
you want to see the
Townhouse.
real thing. Yeah. So anyway, that's the answer to the question. I can't play clave and play the piano at the same time, but you know, when you're playing, there's a thing in Cuban music that the bass does. So if the rhythm's going 1, 2, 3, 4, the bass might be going. Bam, a lot of syncopated movement in the left hand, and you can get a taste of that here in New Orleans with what they call the Big Four: 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, depending how you're counting it. But so. That's the Big Four, and that's related to tumbao, and that's all tied in with clave. So I hope that goes part of the way to answering your question.
Les Hoffman says, tell us about Earl Palmer.
Earl Palmer, okay. Earl Palmer was a drummer from New Orleans who came up in the Treme neighborhood and started out as a young kid, I think, tap dancing. His mother was in vaudeville shows. And he joined, I think he was in Dave Bartholomew's band. I don't know if he was in Edgar Blanchard's band before that, but he played in one of the biggest dance bands in the late 40s. And when they started making records in New Orleans, a lot of the guys that came from that band were the regular call to play on recording sessions at Cosmo's studio, because Dave Bartholomew was a reliable character who record companies from out of town, like Imperial, there's someone he could rely on to get a record made, a good record. They'd send money down to New Orleans, they'd book the time, and they'd trust in Dave Bartholomew. They would hire the good musicians, get the songs, get the artists in there, not put up with any mischief, and come in under budget or on the budget in the limited amount of time, and they'd get a record. So that in a city like New Orleans, that was a very valuable skill. And everybody wanted Earl Palmer because in those days they recorded a performance. They had mics set up, only a handful of mics, in a studio the size of this. And you had to play as near a perfect performance as you could. And sometimes, you know, it wouldn't hear the song or meet the artist until you got into the studio. And they'd often be in there every day cutting sessions. There would be a parade of different people coming through. So they'd have to learn the song, come up with an arrangement, invent a few motifs and fills and riffs and patterns that would make it into a catchy song. And his drumming was remarkable. His time was really good. He played with great dynamics. But Cosmo Matasas told me that he was fantastic because sometimes they would have to do 50 takes. They would do it over and over and over again. And a lot of people just didn't have the stamina to keep playing the same thing over and over again. A lot of musicians will get bored and start doing things differently to kind of keep their interest up. And it might be that on take number 2, you're playing the part that's just right, especially for a drummer. And if you start changing it, then everybody else is suddenly thrown a little bit adrift. Earl Palmer, he said, Cosmo told me, Earl Palmer could play take 50 with as much freshness and vigor as take 2. And that was a really, really important skill in making records in those days. It still is, really. So great drummer, very dynamic, really good time. And that's him you hear on all the Little Richard records. Not all the Little Richard records. Chuck Connor, I think, was a drummer on some of them with the Upsetters. But a lot of the stuff that came out in New Orleans, Professor Longhair, even up to Ernie Cato in the 60s. But he left New Orleans. He was part of a group of musicians that I think they loved New Orleans, but the reality of life for black people in this city at that time, and Creole people, was pretty grim. This is Louisiana, after all. This is the Deep South. And they found that in Los Angeles, things were much more up-to-date, much more modern, and there was a different way of thinking about things and different way of conducting your life. And so they felt much freer and were able to prosper. And he became one of the top session drummers in Los Angeles at a time when the record business really boomed. So he went from being the top guy in New Orleans to being, along with Hal Blaine, one of the top drummers in Los Angeles. And he played on all kinds of stuff. Everybody's heard him without even knowing it. If you've heard Mission Impossible, that's Earl Palmer playing the drums. If you've heard Eddie Cochran, that's Earl Palmer playing the drums. If you've watched the Flintstones, that's Earl Palmer playing the Flintstones theme. He played loads of TV themes. You could call him for anything. And like a lot of the musicians of his generation, he was actually trained after the war with money they got from the GI Bill. And they studied at a school called the Grunewald School of Music. And all the musicians from New Orleans that were in the studio session world all graduated from that school, including Alan Toussaint. So, and on top of all that, he was a very nice chap.
He was the sweetest guy.
Really nice guy.
Yeah.
I liked him. I've still got his number in my phone. I never took it out. He died, sadly.
A while ago.
And I spoke to him on the phone just before he died. I was in L.A. doing a studio session with the Rockettes at Capitol Studios. And I was there playing with Jim Keltner, who was one of the studio guys that came up under Earl Palmer. And we both spoke to Earl on the phone, and he died a couple of days later. But he was a really nice cat, great drummer. And I really dug him. And my favourite memory of Earl Palmer is when one night he came to see the Absolute Monster Gentleman at the Maple Leaf. And the place was absolutely packed. And if any of you have ever been to the Maple Leaf, you know how hot it gets in the Maple Leaf.
It was during Jazz Fest.
It was during Jazz Fest, so the weather was really hot. Earl's wearing a wool suit, impeccably dressed, and he was about 74.
No, I think he was older than
Maybe getting close to 80, I'm not sure. But he squeezed through the crowd and got right in the front, and it was sweat pouring down his face, and stayed there for the whole gig. And then, which of course delighted all the Jelly Bean and Big D and Cornell. Were all like completely blown away as Earl Palmer in the front, digging the hell out of what we were doing. And then he bought a CD and asked us all to sign it for him. So he was a really great guy, real music lover, great musician.
I remember standing outside, and I knew him separately. I knew him from when I worked at Blacktop.
That's right, yeah.
And I walked up, and he said hello to me, and I think it might have surprised you a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
See, I got some cred. Let's see. How about this one? Sam Friedman says, anyone who died too young to become known that you thought were a real special musician when you were coming up?
Well, the first, probably loads, but the first one that comes to my mind is a drummer from London called Kieran O'Connor. And he died very young, although he was older than me. I was 19 probably, and he was probably late 20s or early 30s, so it seemed a bit ancient to me, but that's young now. Kieran O'Connor was a really interesting character. Very bad alcoholic. And he would show up. The first time I ever played with him was Diz Watson, great piano player from London, called and said, can you cover a gig for me that I can't do at the King's Head in Upper Street in Islington. I was back in England after having lived here for a few years. I'd gone back to England and was starting to pick up some gigs. And he said, I can't do the gig. There's a piano there. Kieran's going to play drums. And that was it. So I showed up. And Kieran O'Connor turned up with one drum, 2 drumsticks, and a plastic shopping bag with about 6 bottles in it that were all clinking. And he started drinking and got completely hammered. But he played, man, he was amazing. And he could really play New Orleans drums, which is remarkable, generally speaking, because most people outside of New Orleans, good drummers, have a hard time playing New Orleans music with any degree of authenticity because it's like speaking with a dialect or an accent, you know. And he really could play the New Orleans style Well, what was remarkable was that he didn't know anything about it. He didn't own any of the records. He didn't know who any of the drummers were. He didn't really care particularly. He would go home, put the headphones on, listen to Frankie Goes to Hollywood, and he thought that was one of his favourite records, was whatever that record was. And he was a great jazz drummer. It was his main thing was playing. He'd play jazz gigs, bebop gigs. And I think there's hardly any pieces of footage of him. There's one, I think it's a Robert Wyatt, is that it? There's a song called Shipbuilding. If you go on YouTube, you might be able to find it. It has Kieran O'Connor playing the drums. Kieran died. He went in for an operation and they put him under anaesthetic. He never came out from the anaesthetic, sadly. But he really was a phenomenal drummer, as I say. And when Mac Rebennack came over to England to do some gigs, he fell in love with Kieran's playing. He really loved Kieran's playing. And there's a Dr. John record, if you can find it on vinyl, called Such a Night. Dr. John live in London. And it was right before I joined this particular, I didn't play on that record. I joined a couple of months afterwards. But I was there the night they recorded it. And Mac always raved about Kieran O'Connor's drumming. And Pete Scott, the bass player, who played New Orleans stuff, great too. But there's that version they have of Tipatina with Dr. John is really good, and he really plays it great. So he was the first guy that came to mind.
Well, I think you answered the question.
Yeah, Kieran O'Connor. I'll drink to Kieran.
Want some requests?
Mm-hmm.
Mess around. Sometimes I wonder when the party's over. La vida es un sueño. And Take 5.
Well, there's some good ones in there. Well, Mess Around's kind of fun. Ray Charles. Well, really, Mess Around is credited to, people here think of Mess Around, and Mess Around is a Ray Charles tune. So that riff, that this actually goes, it existed before Mess Around, Cow Cow Blues by Cow Cow Davenport. But it probably existed even before Cow Cow Davenport got it. So all these things, some of them go back to the mists of time, before records were kept. But that's the riff. Popular with New Orleans piano players. Professor Longhair used to play it. Mac Rebennack cut it. And the record is credited to Ray Charles and Ahmet Ertegun. I don't think Ahmet Ertegun had anything to do with writing it. Ray Charles, really. And as I say, Cow Cow Davenport before that. La vida es un sueño. Well, I've played that a couple of times on this show. But La vida es un sueño is Cuban tune by a tres player called Arsenio Rodriguez. And Arsenio Rodriguez was the grandson of slaves. He was kicked by a mule when he was 3 years old or 6 years old and lost his vision. And they called him the Blind Wonder, El Ciego Maravilloso. And very steeped in Afro-Cuban rhythms, he started a band, a sextet, I believe, or septet, I can't remember. But what's remarkable about him is that he was the first guy to incorporate congas into a pop group, if you can call Cuban septets a pop group. But that's kind of what they were at the time. It's popular rhythm. But until that point, congas had always been exclusively in the domain of Afro-Cuban religious ceremonies. And it was a little bit of a heretical move, but he brought congas in. And he had this amazing band in the 1940s, which featured a piano player called Lili Martinez. Ruben Gonzalez also played in his band, and you might remember him from the Buena Vista Social Club. He was the old piano player, great piano player. He was in the Arsenio Rodriguez band for a while, his conjunto. And the conjunto lineup, well, kind of was a revolutionary development at a time when the recording industry was starting. So there are recordings of his band from the 40s. But in the late 50s or early 60s, I'm not sure, he was told of an operation that might be able to restore his eyesight. And he left Cuba and left his band in the capable hands of Felix Chapotin. And they carried on and made lots of great records. But he went to New York, gave up everything, went to New York and had the operation, and it failed. And he wrote this song afterwards, which was incredibly sad, quite a bitter tune in many ways, but a beautiful piece of music, and has become one of the standards in Cuba, and there are lots of various versions of it. It's a good tune because you can utilize lots of substitutions in the chords. But it's called La Vida es un sueño, which translated to English is Life is Just a Dream. Después que no vivo 20 desengaños, que importa uno más? After you've lived 20 disappointments, what does one more matter? And so there's different arrangements, but like I say, it's one of these lovely melodies that you can really have fun with because you can substitute different chords over the melody. And so the first time I heard it was an arrangement that was written by Chucho Valdez, and it was on an LP I brought back that I bought on the street in Havana, and a tribute to Arsenio Rodriguez. But they had this gorgeous, and the horn arrangements were incredible. But this lovely shape in the front. Let me try and remember how it goes. So for an example, you know, on the original version from the, I don't know when the original version was, probably from the 50s, I suppose, but it might sounds old. It might be the late 1940s. The melody goes, "Ay que viví el momento feliz." So do 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 do, diminished to the 1, to the 6, and these are the chords you find in New Orleans rhythm and blues. But what's lovely is instead of when the substitutions, the thing that Chucho Valdez did with it is to use much more modern harmonic ideas. And of course, the harmonic vocabulary expanded hugely through the 50s with jazz musicians into the 60s. And so instead of going, they would go. Play that very well. Instead of just went. And when you're playing chords like that, from a Cuban kind of point of view, from a Cuban piano player's point of view, you can utilize what's called suspended chords. And so you can go like, you know, that idea. You hear that in. And that's the way you voice the chord with an octave on either side in the right hand. And it makes it very strong. That sound of 2 notes, an octave being played together, is much stronger than just 1 note. And my theory is that piano players, especially Lili Martinez, the piano player in Arsenio's band, started voicing the piano parts like this, you know that. Making his octaves really strong, because prior to the piano, that role was played by the tres. Shall I grab the tres?
No, you got 3 minutes. Yeah, why not?
And people who watch this regularly have already might be bored because I'm at risk of repeating myself, but I just happen to have a tres on the other side of this door.
Careful.
And if this thing is in tune, what makes it interesting is there are 2 strings right next to each other, if you can see this. And these strings here are they're the same note but an octave apart. So it's like going like this. Same here. These ones are unison. Not a tune, but. So when this music was played in the countryside in eastern Cuba by peasants out in the fields, there was no piano. But when the music became popular and went into the salons of Havana, a piano was introduced, and so this called a tumbao, which is a melody, but it's a very percussive melody that sets up. Very important part of the band. And so when that music moved from Santiago to Havana at the same time as music moved from New Orleans to Chicago and New York, music that had been played often in the street, the piano became an important instrument, and the piano had to find a role in the band, and it emulated this. So you get... And the piano player that really set the style was Lili Martinez. And as I say, he was the piano player in the orchestra of Arsenio Rodriguez, who was one of the most important Trez players at the time. So that answers that question, hopefully, Arsenio Rodriguez.
Nice. It wasn't a question, it was just, can you play La Vida es un Sueño?
Yeah, La Vida es un Sueño, yeah. So there it is, it's 9 o'clock. Still got some Quarantini in my glass. Shall bid you all a very happy Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning, I guess, if you're in Sydney, and or Japan, or wherever people are watching from. Thank you for tuning in. Next week, Jameson Ross will be my guest, and I advise you to, if you like New Orleans music, you should check out Jameson. He's a great musician. And please check out the Patreon site. There's going to be, I put music up on there that you won't get to hear anywhere else. Some solo piano stuff, and demos and outtakes of songs that you won't hear anywhere else. And forgive me, you Patreonians, whose names I should have been shouting out tonight, but I will do it next week. I'll have a bit more time to prepare. Thank you, and buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
See you next week.
Adios.
All right.